Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Tonight, let's relax with a travelogue from an author perhaps better known for his fiction. Pictures from Italy by Charles Dickens, first published in 1846 and reprinted with 8 illustrations by Chapman and Hall Limited, London, 1913. Let's begin. The Reader's Passport. If the readers of this volume will be so kind as to take their credentials for the different places which are the subject of its author's reminiscences from the author himself, perhaps they may visit them in fancy the more agreeably and with a better understanding of what they are to expect. Many books have been written upon Italy, affording many means of studying the history of that interesting country and the innumerable associations entwined about it. I make but little reference to that stock of information, not at all regarding it as a necessary consequence of my having had recourse to the storehouse for my own benefit, that I should reproduce its easily accessible contents before the eyes of my readers. Neither will there be found in these pages any grave examination into the government or misgovernment of any portion of the country. No visitor of that beautiful land can fail to have a strong conviction on the subject. But as I chose when residing there a foreigner to abstain from the discussion of any such questions with any order of Italians, so I would rather not enter on the inquiry now. During my 12 months' occupation of a house at Genoa, I never found that authorities constitutionally jealous were distrustful of me, and I should be sorry to give them occasion to regret their free courtesy, either to myself or any of my countrymen. There is probably not a famous picture or statue in all Italy but could be easily buried under a mountain of printed paper devoted to dissertations on it. I do not, therefore, though an earnest admirer of painting and sculpture, expatiate at any length on famous pictures and statues. This book is a series of faint reflections, mere shadows in the water, of places to which the imaginations of most people are attracted in a greater or less degree, on which mine had dwelt for years, and which have some interest for all. The greater part of these descriptions were written on the spot, and sent home from time to time in private letters. I do not mention the circumstance as an excuse for any defects they may present, for it would be none, but as a guarantee to the reader that they were at least penned in the fullness of the subject, and with the liveliest impressions of novelty and freshness. If they have ever a fanciful and idle air, perhaps the reader will suppose them written in the shade of a sunny day, in the midst of the objects of which they treat, and will like them none the worse for having such influences of the country upon them. I hope I am not likely to be misunderstood by professors of the Roman Catholic faith on account of anything contained in these pages. I have done my best in one of my former productions to do justice to them, and I trust in this they will do justice to me. When I mention any exhibition that impressed me as absurd or disagreeable, I do not seek to connect it or recognize it as necessarily connected with any essentials of their creed. When I treat of the ceremonies of the Holy Week, I merely treat of their effect, and do not challenge the good and learned Dr. Wiseman's interpretation of their meaning. When I hint a dislike of nunneries for young girls who abjure the world before they have ever proved or known it, or doubt the ex officio sanctity of all priests and friars, I do no more than many conscientious Catholics, both abroad and at home. I have likened these pictures to shadows in the water, and would fain hope that I have nowhere stirred the water so roughly as to mar the shadows. I could never desire to be on better terms with all my friends than now, when distant mountains rise once more in my path, for I need not hesitate to avow that, bent on correcting a brief mistake I made not long ago in disturbing the old relations between myself and my readers, and departing for a moment from my old pursuits, I am about to resume them joyfully in Switzerland, where during another year of absence I can at once work out the themes I have now in my mind without interruption, and while I keep my English audience within speaking distance, extend my knowledge of a noble country inexpressibly attractive to me. This book is made as accessible as possible, because it would be a great pleasure to me if I could hope, through its means, to compare impressions with some among the multitudes who will hereafter visit the scenes described with interest and delight. Going through France. On a fine Sunday morning, in the midsummer time and weather of 1844, it was, my good friend, when— don't be alarmed, not when two travelers might have been observed, slowly making their way over that picturesque and broken ground by which the first chapter of a middle-aged novel is usually attained, but when an English traveling carriage of considerable proportions, fresh from the shady halls of the Pantechnicon near Belgrave Square, London, was observed by a very small French soldier, for I saw him look at it, to issue from the gate of the Hotel Meurice in the Rue Rivoli at Paris. I am no more bound to explain why the English family traveling by this carriage, inside and out, should be starting for Italy on a Sunday morning, of all good days in the week, than I am to assign a reason for all the little men in France being soldiers, and all the big men postilions, which is the invariable rule. But they had some sort of reason for what they did, I have no doubt. And their reason for being there at all was, as you know, that they were going to live in fair Genoa for a year, and that the head of the family purposed in that space of time to stroll about wherever his restless humor carried him. And it would have been small comfort to me to have explained to the population of Paris generally that I was that head and chief, and not the radiant embodiment of good humor who sat beside me in the person of a French courier, best of servants and most beaming of men. Truth to say, he looked a great deal more patriarchal than I, who in the shadow of his portly presence dwindled down to no account at all. There was, of course, very little in the aspect of Paris, as we rattled near the dismal morgue and over the Pont Neuf, to reproach us for our Sunday traveling. The wine shops, every second house, were driving a roaring trade. Awnings were spreading, and chairs and tables arranging outside the cafes, preparatory to the eating of ices and drinking of cool liquids later in the day. Shoeblacks were busy on the bridges. Shops were open. Carts and wagons clattered to and fro. The narrow, uphill, funnel-like streets across the river were so many dense perspectives of crowd and bustle. Party-colored nightcaps, tobacco pipes, blouses, large boots, and shaggy heads of hair. Nothing at that hour denoted a day of rest, unless it were the appearance here and there of a family pleasure party, crammed into a bulky old lumbering cab, or of some contemplative holiday-maker in the freest and easiest déshabillé, leaning out of a low garret window, watching the drying of his newly polished shoes on the little parapet outside, if a gentleman, or the airing of her stockings in the sun, if a lady, with calm anticipation. Once clear of the never-to-be-forgotten or forgiven pavement which surrounds Paris, the first 3 days of traveling towards Marseille are quiet and monotonous enough. To Sens, to Avalon, to Chalons, a sketch of one day's proceedings is a sketch of all three, and here it is. We have 4 horses and 1 postilion, who has a very long whip and drives his team, something like the courier of St. Petersburg in the circle of Asleys or Franconis, only he sits his own horse instead of standing on him. The immense jack-boots worn by these postilions are sometimes a century or 2 old, and are so ludicrously disproportionate to the wearer's foot that the spur which is put where his own heel comes is generally halfway up the leg of the boots. The man often comes out of the stable-yard with his whip in his hand and his shoes on, and brings out in both hands 1 boot at a time, which he plants on the ground by the side of his horse with great gravity until everything is ready. When it is, and oh heaven, the noise they make about it, he gets into the boots, shoes and all, or is hoisted into them by a couple of friends, adjusts the rope harness embossed by the labors of innumerable pigeons in the stables, makes all the horses kick and plunge, cracks his whip like a madman, shouts en route high, and away we go. He is sure to have a contest with his horse before we have gone very far, and then he calls him a thief and a brigand and a pig and what not. There is little more than 1 variety in the appearance of the country for the first 2 days. From a dreary plain to an interminable avenue, and from an interminable avenue to a dreary plain again. Plenty of vines there are in the open fields, but of a short, low kind, and not trained in festoons, but about straight sticks. Beggars innumerable there are everywhere, but an extraordinarily scanty population, and fewer children than I have ever encountered. I don't believe we saw 100 children between Paris and Chalons. Queer old towns, drawbridged and walled, with odd little towers at the angles, like grotesque faces, as if the wall had put a mask on and were staring down into the moat. Other strange little towers in gardens and fields, and down lanes and in farmyards, all alone and always round with a peaked roof, and never used for any purpose at all. Ruinous buildings of all sorts, sometimes a hotel de ville, sometimes a guardhouse, sometimes a dwelling house, sometimes a chateau with a rank garden and watched over by extinguisher-topped turrets, are the standard objects repeated over and over again. Sometimes we pass a village inn with a crumbling wall belonging to it and a perfect town of outhouses, and painted over the gateway a sign saying stabling for 60 horses, as indeed there might be stabling for 60 score, were there any horses to be stabled there, or anybody resting there, or anything stirring about the place but a dangling bush, indicative of the wine inside, which flutters idly in the wind, in lazy keeping with everything else, and certainly is never in a green old age, though always so old as to be dropping to pieces. And all day long, strange little narrow wagons in strings of 6 or 8, bringing cheese from Switzerland, and frequently in charge, the whole line, of one man or even boy, and he very often asleep in the foremost cart, come jingling past, the horses drowsily ringing the bells upon their harness, and looking as if they thought, no doubt they do, their great blue woolly furniture, of immense weight and thickness, with a pair of grotesque horns growing out of the collar, very much too warm for the midsummer weather. Then there is the diligence, twice or thrice a day, with the dusty outsides in blue frocks like butchers, and the insides in white nightcaps, and its cabriolet head on the roof nodding and shaking like an idiot's head, and its young France passengers staring out of window with beards down to their waists, and blue spectacles awfully shading their warlike eyes, and very big sticks clenched in their national grasp. Also the post-mail, with only a couple of passengers, tearing along at a real good daredevil pace, and out of sight in no time. Steady old curés come jolting past now and then, in such ramshackle, rusty, musty, clattering coaches as no Englishman would believe in. And bony women dawdle about in solitary places, holding cows by ropes while they feed, or digging and hoeing, or doing field work of a more laborious kind, or representing real shepherdesses with their flocks. To obtain an adequate idea of which pursuit and its followers in any country, it is only necessary to take any pastoral poem or picture, and imagine to yourself whatever is most exquisitely and widely unlike the descriptions therein contained. You have been traveling along stupidly enough, as you generally do in the last stage of the day, and the 96 bells upon the horses, 24 apiece, have been ringing sleepily in your ears for half an hour or so, and it has become a very jog-trot, monotonous, tiresome sort of business, and you have been thinking deeply about the dinner you will have at the next stage, when down at the end of the long avenue of trees through which you are traveling, the first indication of a town appears, in the shape of some straggling cottages, and the carriage begins to rattle and roll over a horribly uneven pavement, as if the equipage were a great firework, and the mere sight of a smoking cottage chimney had lighted it, instantly it begins to crack and splutter as if the very devil were in it. Whip, wheels, driver, stones, beggars, children, crack, 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 bump, jolt, crack, bump, crick, crack, round the corner, up the narrow street, down the paved hill on the other side, in the gutter, bump, jolt, jog, crick and crack, into the shop windows on the left-hand side of the street, preliminary to a sweeping turn into the wooden archway on the right. Rumble and clatter, and here we are in the yard of the Hôtel de l'Écu d'Or, used up, gone out, smoking, spent, exhausted, but sometimes making a false start unexpectedly, with nothing coming of it, like a firework to the last. The landlady of the Hôtel de l'Écu d'Or is here, and the landlord of the Hôtel de l'Écu d'Or is here, and the femme de chambre of the Hôtel de l'Écu d'Or is here, and a gentleman in a glazed cap, with a red beard like a bosom friend, who is staying at the Hôtel de l'Écu d'Or is here, and Monsieur le Curé is walking up and down in a corner of the yard by himself, with a shovel hat upon his head, and a black gown on his back, and a book in one hand, and an umbrella in the other. And everybody except Monsieur le Curé is open-mouthed and open-eyed for the opening of the carriage door. The landlord of the Hôtel de l'Écu d'Or dotes to that extent upon the courier that he can hardly wait for his coming down from the box, but embraces his very legs and boot heels as he descends. My courier, my brave courier, my friend, my brother. The landlady loves him, the femme de chambre blesses him, the garçon worships him. The courier asks if his letter has been received. It has, it has. Are the rooms prepared? They are, they are. The best rooms for my noble courier, the rooms of state for my gallant courier. The whole house is at the service of my best of friends. He keeps his hand upon the carriage door, and asks some other question to enhance the expectation. He carries a green leathern purse outside his coat, suspended by a belt. The idlers look at it. One touches it. It is full of 5-franc pieces. Murmurs of admiration are heard among the boys. The landlord falls upon the courier's neck and folds him to his breast. He is so much fatter than he was, he says. He looks so rosy and so well. The door is opened. Breathless expectation. The lady of the family gets out. Ah, sweet lady, beautiful lady. The sister of the lady of the family gets out. Great heaven, Mademoiselle is charming. First little boy gets out. Ah, what a beautiful little boy. First little girl gets out. Oh, but this is an enchanting child. Second little girl gets out. The landlady, yielding to the finest impulse of our common nature, catches her up in her arms. Second little boy gets out. Oh, the sweet boy, Oh, the tender little family. The baby is handed out. Angelic baby. The baby has topped everything. All the rapture is expended on the baby. Then the two nurses tumble out, and the enthusiasm swelling into madness, the whole family are swept upstairs as on a cloud, while the idlers press about the carriage and look into it, and walk round it and touch it, for it is something to touch a carriage that has held so many people. It is a legacy to leave one's children. The rooms are on the first floor, except the nursery for the night, which is a great rambling chamber with 4 or 5 beds in it, through a dark passage, up 2 steps, down 4, past a pump, across a balcony, and next door to the stable. The other sleeping apartments are large and lofty, each with 2 small bedsteads, tastefully hung like the windows with red and white drapery. The sitting room is famous. Dinner is already laid in it for 3, and the napkins are folded in cocked hat fashion. The floors are of red tile. There are no carpets and not much furniture to speak of, but there is abundance of looking-glass, and there are large vases under glass shades filled with artificial flowers. And there are plenty of clocks. The whole party are in motion. The brave courier in particular is everywhere, looking after the beds, having wine poured down his throat by his dear brother the landlord, and picking up green cucumbers, always cucumbers. Heaven knows where he gets them, with which he walks about, one in each hand like truncheons. Dinner is announced. There is very thin soup. There are very large loaves, 1 apiece, a fish, 4 dishes afterwards, some poultry afterwards, a dessert afterwards, and no lack of wine. There is not much in the dishes, but they are very good and always ready instantly. When it is nearly dark, the brave courier, having eaten the 2 cucumbers, sliced up in the contents of a pretty large decanter of oil and another of vinegar, emerges from his retreat below and proposes a visit to the cathedral, whose massive tower frowns down upon the courtyard of the inn. Off we go, and very solemn and grand it is in the dim light, so dim at last that the polite old lantern-jawed sacristan has a feeble little bit of candle in his hand to grope among the tombs with, and looks among the grim columns very like a lost ghost who is searching for his own. Underneath the balcony when we return, the inferior servants of the inn are supping in the open air at a great table. The dish, a stew of meat and vegetables, smoking hot and served in the iron cauldron it was boiled in. They have a pitcher of thin wine and are very merry. Merrier than the gentleman with the red beard, who is playing billiards in the light room on the left of the yard, where shadows with cues in their hands and cigars in their mouths cross and recross the window constantly. Still the thin curé walks up and down alone, with his book and umbrella. And there he walks, and there the billiard balls rattle, long after we are fast asleep. We are astir at 6 next morning. It is a delightful day, shaming yesterday's mud upon the carriage, if anything could shame a carriage in a land where carriages are never cleaned. Everybody is brisk, and as we finish breakfast, the horses come jingling into the yard from the post house. Everything taken out of the carriage is put back again. The brave courier announces that all is ready, after walking into every room and looking all round it, to be certain that nothing is left behind. Everybody gets in. Everybody connected with the Hôtel de l'Écu d'Or is again enchanted. The brave courier runs into the house for a parcel containing cold fowl, sliced ham, bread, and biscuits for lunch, hands it into the coach, and runs back again. What has he got in his hand now? More cucumbers? No, a long strip of paper. It's the bill. The brave courier has 2 belts on this morning, one supporting the purse, another a mighty good sort of leather bottle, filled to the throat with the best light Bordeaux wine in the house. He never pays the bill till this bottle is full, and then he disputes it. He disputes it now violently. He is still the landlord's brother, but by another father or mother. He is not so nearly related to him as he was last night. The landlord scratches his head. The brave courier points to certain figures in the bill and intimates that if they remain there, the Hôtel de l'Écu d'Or is thenceforth and forever an Hôtel de l'Écu de Cuivre. The landlord goes into a little counting house. The brave courier follows, forces the bill and a pen into his hand, and talks more rapidly than ever. The landlord takes the pen. The courier smiles. The landlord makes an alteration. The courier cuts a joke. The landlord is affectionate, but not weakly so. He bears it like a man. He shakes hands with his brave brother, but he doesn't hug him. Still, he loves his brother, for he knows that he will be returning that way one of these fine days with another family, and he foresees that his heart will yearn towards him again. The brave courier traverses all round the carriage once, looks at the drag, inspects the wheels, jumps up, gives the word, and away we go. It is market morning. The market is held in the little square outside in front of the cathedral. It is crowded with men and women in blue and red and green and white, with canvassed stalls and fluttering merchandise. The country people are grouped about, with their clean baskets before them. Here the lace sellers, there the butter and egg sellers, over there the fruit sellers, and there the shoemakers. The whole place looks as if it were the stage of some great theater, and the curtain had just run up for a picturesque ballet. And there is the cathedral to boot, scene-like, all grim and swarthy and mouldering and cold, just splashing the pavement in one place, with faint purple drops, as the morning sun, entering by a little window on the eastern side, struggles through some stained glass panes on the western. In 5 minutes we have passed the Iron Cross, with a little ragged kneeling place of turf before it on the outskirts of the town, and are again upon the road. Lyon, the Rhone, and the Goblin of Avignon. Chalons is a fair resting place, in right of its good inn on the bank of the river, and the little steamboats, gay with green and red paint, that come and go upon it, which make up a pleasant and refreshing scene after the dusty roads. But unless you would like to dwell on an enormous plain, with jagged rows of irregular poplars on it, that look in the distance like so many combs with broken teeth, and unless you would like to pass your life without the possibility of going uphill or going up anything but stairs, you would hardly approve of Chalons as a place of residence. You would probably like it better, however, than Lyons, which you may reach, if you will, in one of the before-mentioned steamboats in 8 hours. What a city Lyons is! Talk about people feeling at certain unlucky times as if they had tumbled from the clouds. Here is a whole town that is tumbled, anyhow, out of the sky, having been first caught up, like other stones that tumble down from that region, out of fens and barren places, dismal to behold. The 2 great streets through which the 2 great rivers dash, and all the little streets whose name is Legion, were scorching, blistering, and sweltering. The houses, high and vast, dirty to excess, rotten as old cheeses, and as thickly peopled. All up the hills that hem the city in, these houses swarm, and the mites inside were lolling out of the windows and drying their ragged clothes on poles, and crawling in and out at the doors, and coming out to pant and gasp upon the pavement, and creeping in and out among huge piles and bales of fusty, musty, stifling goods, and living, or rather not dying, till their time should come in an exhausted receiver. Every manufacturing town melted into one would hardly convey an impression of Lyons as it presented itself to me, for all the undrained, unscavengered qualities of a foreign town seem grafted there upon the native miseries of a manufacturing one, and it bears such fruit as I would go some miles out of my way to avoid encountering again. In the cool of the evening, or rather in the faded heat of the day, we went to see the cathedral, where divers old women and a few dogs were engaged in contemplation. There was no difference in point of cleanliness between its stone pavement and that of the streets. And there was a wax saint in a little box like a berth aboard ship, with a glass front to it, whom Madame Tussaud would have nothing to say to on any terms. If you would know all about the architecture of this church or any other, its dates, dimensions, endowments, and history, is it not written in Mr. Murray's guidebook? And may you not read it there with thanks to him as I did? For this reason I should abstain from mentioning the curious clock in Lyons Cathedral, if it were not for a small mistake I made in connection with that piece of mechanism. The keeper of the church was very anxious it should be shown, partly for the honor of the establishment and the town, and partly perhaps because of his deriving a percentage from the additional consideration. However that may be, it was set in motion, and thereupon a host of little doors flew open, and innumerable little figures staggered out of them, and jerked themselves back again, with that especial unsteadiness of purpose and hitching in the gait which usually attaches to figures that are moved by clockwork. Meanwhile, the sacristan stood explaining these wonders and pointing them out severally with a wand. There was a center puppet of the Virgin Mary, and close to her a small pigeonhole, out of which another and a very ill-looking puppet made one of the most sudden plunges I ever saw accomplished, instantly flopping back again at sight of her and banging his little door violently after him. Taking this to be emblematic of the victory over sin and death, and not at all unwilling to show that I perfectly understood the subject, in anticipation of the showman, I rashly said, "Aha, the evil spirit, to be sure. He is very soon disposed of." "Pardon, monsieur," said the sacristan, with a polite motion of his hand towards the little door, as if introducing somebody. "The angel Gabriel." Soon after daybreak next morning, we were steaming down the arrowy Rhone at the rate of 20 miles an hour in a very dirty vessel full of merchandise, and with only 3 or 4 other passengers for our companions, among whom the most remarkable was a silly, old, meek-faced, garlic-eating, immeasurably polite chevalier, with a dirty scrap of red ribbon hanging at his buttonhole, as if he had tied it there to remind himself of something, as Tom Noddy in the farce ties knots in his pocket handkerchief. For the last 2 days we had seen great sullen hills, the first indications of the Alps, lowering in the distance. Now we were rushing on beside them, sometimes close beside them, sometimes with an intervening slope covered with vineyards. Villages and small towns hanging in mid-air, with great woods of olives, seen through the light open towers of their churches, and clouds moving slowly on upon the steep acclivity behind them. Ruined castles perched on every eminence, and scattered houses in the clefts and gullies of the hills made it very beautiful. The great height of these, too, making the buildings look so tiny that they had all the charm of elegant models. Their excessive whiteness, as contrasted with the brown rocks, or the somber, deep, dull, heavy green of the olive tree, and the puny size and little slow walk of the Lilliputian men and women on the bank, made a charming picture. There were ferries out of number, too, bridges, the famous Pont d'Esprit, towns where memorable wines are made, Valence, where Napoleon studied, and the noble river, bringing at every winding turn new beauties into view. There lay before us that same afternoon the broken bridge of Avignon, and all the city baking in the sun, yet with an underdone pie-crust, battlemented wall that will never be brown, though it bake for centuries. The grapes were hanging in clusters in the streets, and the brilliant oleander was in full bloom everywhere. The streets are old and very narrow, but tolerably clean, and shaded by awnings stretched from house to house. Bright stuffs and handkerchiefs, curiosities, ancient frames of carved wood, old chairs, ghostly tables, saints, virgins, and angels, and staring daubs of portraits being exposed for sale beneath. It was very quaint and lively. All this was much set off, too, by the glimpses one caught through a rusty gate standing ajar of quiet, sleepy courtyards, having stately old houses within as silent as tombs. It was all very like one of the descriptions in the Arabian Nights. The three one-eyed calendars might have knocked at any one of those doors till the street rang again, and the porter who persisted in asking questions, the man who had the delicious purchases put into his basket in the morning, might have opened it quite naturally. After breakfast next morning, we sallied forth to see the lions. Such a delicious breeze was blowing in from the north as made the walk delightful, though the pavement stones and stones of the walls and houses were far too hot to have a hand laid on them comfortably. We went first of all up a rocky height to the cathedral, where Mass was performing to an auditory very like that of Lyon, namely several old women, a baby, and a very self-possessed dog, who had marked out for himself a little course or platform for exercise, beginning at the altar rails and ending at the door, up and down which constitutional walk he trotted during the service, as methodically and calmly as any old gentleman out of doors. It is a bare old church, and the paintings in the roof are sadly defaced by time and damp weather, but the sun was shining in splendidly through the red curtains of the windows and glittering on the altar furniture, and it looked as bright and cheerful as need be. Going apart in this church to see some painting which was being executed in fresco by a French artist and his pupil, I was led to observe more closely than I might otherwise have done a great number of votive offerings with which the walls of the different chapels were profusely hung. I will not say decorated, for they were very roughly and comically got up, most likely by poor sign painters who eke out their living in that way. They were all little pictures, each representing some sickness or calamity from which the person placing it there had escaped through the interposition of his or her patron saint or of the Madonna, and I may refer to them as good specimens of the class generally. They are abundant in Italy. In a grotesque squareness of outline and impossibility of perspective, they are not unlike the woodcuts in old books, but they were oil paintings, and the artist, like the painter of the Primrose family, had not been sparing of his colors. In one, a lady was having a toe amputated, an operation which a saintly personage had sailed into the room to superintend. In another, a lady was lying in bed, tucked up very tight and prim, and staring with much composure at a tripod with a slop basin on it, the usual form of washing stand, and the only piece of furniture beside the bedstead in her chamber. One would never have supposed her to be laboring under any complaint, beyond the inconvenience of being miraculously wide awake, if the painter had not hit upon the idea of putting all her family on their knees in one corner, with their legs sticking out behind them on the floor like boot trees, above whom the Virgin on a kind of blue divan promised to restore the patient. In another case, a lady was in the very act of being run over, immediately outside the city walls, by a sort of pianoforte van. But the Madonna was there again. Whether the supernatural appearance had startled the horse, a bay griffin, or whether it was invisible to him, I don't know, but he was galloping away without the smallest reverence or compunction, though votive offerings were not unknown in pagan temples, and are evidently among the many compromises made between the false religion and the true, when the true was in its infancy, I could wish that all the other compromises were as harmless. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading of Pictures from Italy by Charles Dickens. Perhaps in our next episode, we'll actually get to Italy. But his observations of France were quite interesting. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the few illustrations included, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. The description also includes links to ways you can help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free, including becoming a member of our Patreon, where you'll receive exclusive perks found nowhere else, or dropping us a one-time tip on buymeacoffee.com, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. I'm so glad you could join me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.